Impossible to endure. 35 degrees Celsius cold. Pit bull brings 2 puppies to a man's house to beg for help. In the heart of a frozen winter, where temperatures dropped to an unbearable 35 degrees C, a mother pit bull made a desperate choice. Carrying her 2 tiny puppies, she approached a stranger's house, her eyes pleading for help. What happened next would not only save her family but also transform the lives of the man and his children forever. This is a story of survival, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Stay with us as we unravel this heartwarming tale of compassion and hope. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Let's dive into this unforgettable journey. The frigid wind howled through the small, snow-covered town as Sam Peterson, a widowed father of 2, stoked the fire in his living room. His modest home was nestled at the edge of a wooded area where the relentless winter had transformed the landscape into a frozen tundra. Inside, his children, Emma and Jake, played quietly with their toys, their laughter a warm contrast to the bitter cold outside. Just as Sam settled into his armchair, a faint, desperate scratching sound echoed from the front door. He froze, his brows furrowing. The sound came again, this time accompanied by a soft, high-pitched whimper. Setting down his coffee, Sam stood and moved cautiously toward the door, his breath visible in the icy air. When he opened the door, a rush of freezing wind swept in. But what stopped him in his tracks was the sight before him. A shivering pit bull stood on the porch, her fur coated with frost. In her mouth, she gently carried a tiny, whimpering puppy. Another pup huddled at her feet, its small body trembling from the cold. The mother's eyes met Sam's, wide, pleading, and filled with desperation. She didn't bark or growl. Instead, she nudged the puppy in her mouth toward him, as if begging him to help. Sam's heart clenched. "Oh my God," he muttered, kneeling to inspect the dogs. The pups were so small, their tiny bodies barely able to handle the biting cold. The mother licked her pups and looked back at Sam, her body sagging with exhaustion. "Emma! Jake!" Sam called over his shoulder. "Grab some blankets. Hurry!" A decision made. Minutes later, Sam had wrapped the mother and her pups in warm blankets and brought them into the living room. The children watched with wide eyes as the dogs began to thaw out by the fire. Emma knelt beside the mother pit bull, gently stroking her frost-covered fur. "She's so skinny," Emma whispered, her voice filled with concern. Jake, always the curious one, asked, "Dad, why is she outside in this weather? Where's her home?" Sam didn't have an answer. "I don't know, buddy," he said softly, "but she came to us for a reason. Let's take care of her for now." As the warmth of the fire began to seep into their bones, the mother pit bull let out a low, contented sigh. The pups nestled against her, their tiny eyes fluttering shut as they drifted off to sleep. Sam watched them, his chest tightening with a mix of sadness and resolve. "She's trusting us," Sam thought, his gaze fixed on the mother dog. "And we're not going to let her down." The next morning, the sun barely pierced through the thick layer of gray clouds that blanketed the small town. Inside Sam's home, the warmth of the fireplace created a stark contrast to the unforgiving cold outside. The mother pit bull lay curled up on a pile of blankets near the hearth, her 2 tiny pups nestled against her belly. She watched Sam cautiously as he moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast for his children. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor next to the dogs, her hand gently stroking the mother's fur. "Dad, can we name her?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. Sam paused, glancing over at the scene. The mother pit bull, still skittish, flinched slightly at Emma's touch, but didn't move away. Her eyes followed Sam's every movement, a mix of weariness and trust beginning to form. "What do you think we should call her?" Sam asked, leaning against the counter. Emma's face lit up. "How about Grace? She's so brave, carrying her babies here in the cold." Sam smiled faintly. "Grace," he repeated, testing the name. "Yeah, that fits." As the family settled down to breakfast, Grace stood and stretched cautiously, her ribs visible under her thin coat. She approached the table slowly, her movements deliberate, as if unsure of her welcome. Sam placed a plate of scrambled eggs on the floor. "Here," he said softly, stepping back to give her space. "You need this more than we do." Grace hesitated for a moment before lowering her head to eat, her movements still slow but increasingly confident. The pups, now more alert, toddled clumsily after her, sniffing curiously at the food. Emma giggled as one of them stumbled, its tiny legs slipping on the smooth floor. "Dad," Jake said, his voice breaking the moment of warmth, "why do you think she came here?" Sam's expression grew serious. "I think she didn't have a choice," he said, his gaze drifting to the frost-covered window. "Out there, in this weather, they wouldn't have made it. She came to us because we were her last hope." Jake frowned, his young mind grappling with the weight of the situation. "So, does that mean someone left her out there?" Sam nodded grimly. "It's possible. Dogs like her, pit bulls, they're not always treated fairly. Some people don't give them a chance." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "That's not right. She's so sweet." "She is," Sam agreed, "and she's lucky to have found us." Later that day, Sam loaded Grace and her pups into his old truck. The snow had let up, but the air was still biting, and the roads were slick with ice. Emma and Jake insisted on coming along, bundled in layers of scarves and jackets as they piled into the back seat. At the local vet's office, Grace seemed nervous, her body tensing as they entered the building. Sam kept a firm but gentle hand on her leash, offering quiet reassurance. The vet, a kind woman named Dr. Morgan, greeted them with a warm smile. "She's beautiful," Dr. Morgan said, kneeling to get a closer look at Grace. "And her pups look healthy, considering the circumstances." "She found us last night," Sam explained, "carrying her pups in that weather. I just want to make sure they're okay." Dr. Morgan nodded, her expression softening. "She's a survivor, that's for sure. Let's take a look." As Dr. Morgan examined Grace and her pups, she explained the toll the cold and malnutrition had likely taken on them. Grace had frostbite on her ears and paws, and she was severely underweight, but with proper care, she would recover. The pups, though small, were surprisingly healthy, a testament to their mother's determination. "She must have done everything she could to keep them warm," Dr. Morgan said, her voice filled with admiration. "She's remarkable." Sam felt a lump in his throat as he watched Grace lick one of her pups protectively. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She is." That evening, as the family returned home, Grace seemed more at ease. She followed Sam into the house without hesitation, her pups trailing after her. Emma and Jake set up a makeshift bed for them near the fire, layering blankets and pillows to create a warm, cozy space. As the kids played with the pups, Grace watched from her spot on the blankets. Her eyes, once wary, now held a softness that hadn't been there before. Sam knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her head. "You're safe now," he said. "No more cold, no more fear." Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Sam stared at the scene on his porch, the icy wind biting his face. Grace stood with her two pups at her side, her gaze steady and imploring. Next to her was a young stray, its thin frame trembling as it leaned into Grace for warmth. It was clear Grace had taken it under her wing, much like she'd brought her own pups to safety. Without hesitation, Sam opened the door wider. "All right," he said softly. "Come on in." Grace led the small group inside, the younger dog hesitating at first, but following her lead. Emma and Jake ran to the living room, their faces lighting up when they saw the new arrival. "Another dog!" Jake exclaimed. "Dad, what's going on?" Sam sighed, closing the door against the cold. "It seems like Grace brought a friend. Maybe she knows they need help too." The kids immediately began setting up another blanket near the fire, their excitement infectious. The young stray, still nervous, took tentative steps toward the warmth, its eyes darting around the room. As the night went on, the young stray began to relax, its body visibly warming under the fire's glow. Grace stayed close, her watchful eyes never leaving her new companion. It was as though she had assumed the role of protector not just for her pups, but for any dog in need. Jake crouched near the new arrival, holding out a small piece of bread. "Here, you must be hungry," he said gently. The dog sniffed the bread cautiously before taking it, its tail wagging slightly for the first time. Emma smiled. "Dad, it's like Grace is telling us to help all the dogs who need it." Sam knelt beside her, his hand resting on Grace's head. "Maybe she is," he murmured. "And maybe we should listen." Over the next few days, the household settled into a new routine. Grace and her pups grew stronger, their playful personalities beginning to shine. The young stray, whom Emma named Buddy, followed Grace everywhere, clearly taking comfort in her presence. Sam couldn't help but notice how much Grace's actions mirrored his own journey as a father. She had faced impossible odds to protect her family, and now she was extending that care to others. It was a lesson in resilience and compassion that touched him deeply. One evening, as Sam sat by the fire, Grace approached him. She rested her head on his knee, her eyes full of gratitude. Sam stroked her gently, his voice soft. "You've done more for us than we've done for you," he said. "Thank you, Grace." The howl echoed through the cold night, sending a shiver down Sam's spine. Grace stood by the door, her posture alert, her gaze fixed on the dark expanse outside. Her pups and Buddy huddled close, their eyes darting nervously toward the sound. Sam grabbed his coat and flashlight, glancing back at the children. "Stay inside with the dogs," he said firmly. "I'll check it out." "Be careful, Dad," Emma whispered, clutching Buddy protectively. Stepping into the frigid night, Sam followed the tracks leading away from the house. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a lone figure trudging through the deep snow. As he drew closer, he realized it was another dog, thin, matted, and limping slightly. "Hey there," Sam called softly, crouching to make himself less intimidating. The dog froze, its body trembling as it stared at him with wide, fearful eyes. Slowly, Grace appeared at Sam's side, her presence calming. She let out a low, reassuring whine, stepping forward to nudge the dog gently. The stray hesitated but eventually leaned into Grace's touch, its tail wagging weakly. Sam let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "All right," he said, reaching for the dog carefully. "Let's get you out of this cold." Back at the house, Emma and Jake helped settle the new arrival near the fire. The dog, a mix of brown and white with patches of missing fur, looked at them warily, but allowed Emma to wrap it in a warm blanket. "Dad, that's the third dog Grace has brought to us," Jake said. "Do you think she knows there are more out there?" Sam sat down heavily, his eyes on Grace. "I think she does," he said quietly. "She's not just surviving. She's saving others." Grace lay down beside the new dog, licking its face gently. It was clear she had no intention of stopping until every dog she could find was safe. Sam stared at the back door, his breath catching in his throat. The scratching was faint but persistent, almost drowned out by the howling wind outside. Grace stood beside him, her ears perked and her tail stiff. She let out a low whimper, nudging Sam's leg as if urging him to act. "All right, Grace," he muttered, grabbing his coat and flashlight again. "Let's see what's out there." The cold hit him like a slap as he stepped outside, the flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness. Snowflakes swirled in the air, and his boots crunched against the frozen ground. Grace stayed close, her body tense and alert. The scratching grew louder as they approached the side of the house, and Sam's heart sank when he spotted the source. Huddled against the wall was another dog, smaller than the others they had taken in. Its coat was a patchy mix of gray and black, and it shivered violently, its ribs visible beneath its thin fur. The dog's eyes reflected the light, wide with fear but tinged with desperate hope. Grace moved forward, letting out a soft whine, and the dog responded with a weak wag of its tail. Sam crouched down slowly, holding out his hand. "It's okay," he said softly, his breath visible in the freezing air. "You're safe now." The dog hesitated, its body trembling, but Grace stepped in, licking its face and nudging it gently. The interaction seemed to give the stray the courage it needed, and it inched closer to Sam, its movements slow and deliberate. Sam slipped off his gloves, his hands trembling from the cold, and scooped the dog into his arms. It was painfully light, its small frame fitting easily against his chest. Once inside, Sam set the dog down near the fire, where Emma and Jake had already prepared blankets and food. The children worked quickly, their small hands gentle as they dried the dog's fur and offered it water. Grace watched over them like a sentinel, her gaze never leaving the new arrival. "Dad," Emma said softly, glancing up at him, "how many more do you think are out there?" Sam didn't answer right away. He rubbed the back of his neck, his mind racing. "I don't know, sweetheart," he admitted finally, "but if Grace keeps finding them, we're going to do what we can." Jake frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. "But what if it's too much? We're just one family." Sam knelt beside his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We can't save them all," he said gently. "But we can save the ones who come to us. And maybe that's enough." The family spent the next few hours tending to the newest arrival, whom Emma quickly named Shadow. The small dog's initial fear began to melt away as it warmed by the fire, its tail wagging tentatively when Jake offered it a piece of bread. Grace stayed close, her presence clearly reassuring the stray. Sam couldn't help but marvel at the way she seemed to instinctively know what these dogs needed. She wasn't just surviving, she was leading. As the household settled down for the night, Sam found himself staring at the growing pack of dogs in his living room. Grace, her two pups, Buddy, and now Shadow, all lay together near the fire, their bodies relaxed and their breathing even. It was a sight that filled him with both pride and a growing sense of responsibility. These dogs had nowhere else to go, and somehow they had found him. The next morning, Sam woke to the sound of laughter. He followed it to the backyard, where Emma and Jake were playing with the dogs in the snow. Grace bounded through the drifts, her pups chasing after her, while Buddy and Shadow wrestled playfully nearby. The children's laughter mingled with the barks and yips, creating a symphony of joy that seemed to chase away the winter chill. Sam leaned against the doorway, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in a long time, his home felt alive. But as he watched the scene unfold, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. The number of dogs they had taken in was growing, and their resources were finite. If Grace continued to bring more strays, how would they manage? That afternoon, Sam decided to pay a visit to the local animal shelter. It was a small, modest building on the outskirts of town, run by a handful of volunteers. The director, a kind woman named Linda, greeted him warmly. "Sam, it's good to see you," Linda said, shaking his hand. "What brings you in today?" Sam hesitated, glancing at the bulletin board behind her, filled with photos of adoptable animals. "I've taken in a few strays," he said finally. "Well, more than a few, and I'm realizing I might need some help." Linda listened as Sam recounted the story of Grace and the dogs she had brought to his doorstep. Her expression softened as he spoke, her eyes glistening with emotion. "It sounds like you've been doing incredible work," she said. "But you're right, this isn't something you can do alone." She handed him a flyer for an upcoming community event, a fundraiser for the shelter. "Why don't you come and share your story?" Linda suggested. "You'd be surprised how many people are willing to help if they just know what's going on." Sam nodded slowly, the idea taking root in his mind. "I'll think about it," he said, tucking the flyer into his pocket. As he drove home, Sam's thoughts turned to Grace. She had brought so much change to their lives in such a short time. Her determination to save not just her pups, but every stray she encountered was nothing short of inspiring. If Grace could do all of this with nothing but her instincts and her heart, surely he could find a way to support her mission. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Sam shared his plan. "I think we need to do more than just take care of the dogs Grace brings to us," he said. "We need to involve the community." Emma's eyes lit up. "Like a rescue group?" "Exactly," Sam said. "We can work with the shelter, hold fundraisers, and get more people involved. Grace showed us what's possible. Now it's our turn to step up." Jake grinned, his excitement matching his sister's. "Can we call it Grace's Haven?" Sam chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "I think that's a perfect name." As the family sat together, brainstorming ideas for their new mission, Grace lay at Sam's feet, her head resting on her paws. She watched them with calm, knowing eyes, as if she understood the role she had played in bringing them to this moment. For the first time in a long time, Sam felt not just hopeful, but purposeful. Grace had given them more than a reason to care. She had given them a new beginning. The cold outside raged on, but inside their home, warmth and determination filled the air. Grace and her growing pack had found their haven, and in doing so, they had given Sam and his family a purpose greater than themselves. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, one paw at a time. The days following the family's decision to create Grace's Haven were a whirlwind of activity. Sam threw himself into preparations, reaching out to Linda at the shelter for guidance on how to get started. They discussed logistics, from setting up a donation fund to gathering supplies like food, blankets, and medical care for the growing number of dogs. Linda offered to host a small event at the shelter to introduce the idea to the community, and Sam agreed, realizing how much of an impact this could have. Back at home, the energy was electric. Emma and Jake were more involved than ever, helping their dad design flyers for the event and brainstorming ways to spread the word. Emma drew a picture of Grace with her two pups, surrounded by paw prints and the words, "Grace's Haven, a home for every stray," written boldly at the top. Sam couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "That's perfect, Em," he said, hanging the poster on the fridge. "I think Grace would approve." Grace, as if understanding her name was mentioned, perked up from her spot near the fire. She had fully embraced her role as the heart of their home, watching over her pups, Buddy and Shadow, with a quiet dignity. She still kept a sharp eye on the windows and doors, as if expecting another stray to arrive at any moment. One evening, as the family sat together planning the event, Grace stood abruptly, her ears twitching. Sam followed her gaze toward the window, where a light snow had begun to fall. She padded over to the door and let out a soft whine, her body tense. "What is it, girl?" Sam asked, rising from his chair. He opened the door, and Grace bolted outside, her paws crunching against the snow as she headed toward the woods. Sam grabbed his coat and flashlight, motioning for the kids to stay inside. Grace's figure was barely visible as she disappeared into the trees, but Sam followed her, his heart pounding. The cold bit at his skin, and the wind howled through the branches, but he trusted Grace's instincts. She had never led him astray before. After several minutes of trekking through the snow, Sam's flashlight beam caught movement ahead. Grace was standing in a small clearing, her body low to the ground, her tail wagging cautiously. In front of her was another dog, its coat dark and matted with ice. This one was larger than the others Grace had brought back, and it growled softly as Sam approached. Easy, Sam murmured, keeping his voice calm. We're not here to hurt you. Grace stepped forward, her movements deliberate and gentle. She nudged the dog's shoulder with her nose, her tail wagging in reassurance. The dog's growling ceased, replaced by a low whine as it lowered its head. Grace turned back to Sam, her eyes meeting his as if to say, "It's okay now." Sam crouched down, extending a hand. The dog hesitated, but eventually inched closer, its wet nose brushing against his fingers. Sam took off his coat and draped it over the dog's back, shielding it from the cold. "Let's get you home," he said softly. Back at the house, Emma and Jake were waiting anxiously by the door. Their faces lit up when they saw Sam and Grace return with the new dog. "Another one," Jake exclaimed, running to grab blankets. "What should we call him?" Sam looked at the dog, now lying by the fire as Emma carefully dried his fur. He was large and imposing, but there was a gentleness in his eyes that reminded Sam of Grace. "How about Titan?" he suggested. Emma beamed. "Titan. I like it." Over the next few days, Titan settled into the household, though he remained wary of sudden movements and loud noises. Grace seemed to sense his unease, often lying close to him as if to offer silent support. Sam couldn't help but marvel at her ability to connect with every dog she encountered, no matter how broken or frightened they seemed. As the event at the shelter approached, Sam began to feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. Would the community respond to their efforts? Would they be able to make a real difference? These questions weighed on his mind, but every time he looked at Grace, he felt a renewed sense of determination. She had faced impossible odds to save her family and others like her. If she could do that, surely he could do his part. The night before the event, the family gathered in the living room, surrounded by the pack of dogs that had become their extended family. Emma and Jake were putting the finishing touches on the flyers, while Sam went over his speech one last time. Grace lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws as her pups curled up beside her. "Tomorrow's a big day," Sam said, scratching behind Grace's ears. "Let's show everyone what you've started." Grace's tail thumped softly against the floor, and for a moment Sam could have sworn she understood every word. The journey ahead would be challenging, but with Grace leading the way, he knew they were ready to take the next step. The day of the event dawned crisp and clear, the sun reflecting off the fresh layer of snow that blanketed the small town. Sam loaded the truck with flyers, donation boxes, and blankets, while Emma and Jake excitedly wrangled Grace and her pups into the back seat. Buddy, Shadow, and Titan, though tempted to join, were left at home with extra treats and a warm fire to enjoy. The shelter was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Volunteers were setting up tables, arranging banners, and unloading crates of supplies. Linda greeted them warmly at the entrance, her eyes lighting up when she saw Grace. "This is the famous Grace," she said with a smile, crouching to scratch the pit bull's ears. "I've heard so much about you." Grace wagged her tail, leaning into Linda's touch. Her pups stayed close, their wide eyes taking in the bustling scene. Emma and Jake immediately began handing out flyers, their enthusiasm infectious as they explained Grace's story to anyone who would listen. As the event got underway, Sam felt a mix of pride and nerves. He had never been one for public speaking, but when Linda invited him to take the microphone, he knew he couldn't back down. With Grace at his side, he stepped onto the small stage, the chatter of the crowd quieting as he began to speak. "Good morning, everyone," Sam started, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Thank you for being here today. I'd like to share a story about a dog who changed my family's life." He recounted the night Grace arrived at their door, carrying her pups through the brutal cold. He spoke of her courage, her instinct to protect, and the way she had brought not only her family, but others to safety. "Grace didn't just save her pups," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "She taught us the meaning of resilience and compassion, and she reminded us that we all have the power to make a difference. The audience listened intently, many wiping away tears as Sam finished his speech. Applause erupted, and Sam stepped off the stage, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and gratitude. Emma and Jake ran to him, their faces beaming. "You did great, Dad," Jake said, throwing his arms around him. As the event continued, donations began to pour in. People dropped money into the boxes, signed up to volunteer, and brought bags of dog food and blankets to the shelter. Several families expressed interest in adopting, moved by Grace's story and the mission of Grace's Haven. By the end of the day, Sam felt a sense of accomplishment, unlike anything he'd experienced before. The community had rallied around their cause, and it was clear that Grace's journey had inspired something much larger than their small family. Back at home that evening, the family sat together in the living room, surrounded by their pack of dogs. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the air was filled with a quiet contentment. Grace lay at Sam's feet, her head resting on her paws as she watched the children play with her pups. Sam reached down to scratch her ears, his voice soft. "We did it, Grace," he said. "Because of you, we're making a difference." Grace wagged her tail, her eyes filled with a calm, knowing gratitude. She had found her haven, and now, thanks to her, so would many others. Together, they had not only survived, but created something beautiful, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. As donations poured in, Grace's Haven became a beacon of hope for abandoned dogs in the town. Volunteers came forward, families offered their homes, and the shelter's reach grew beyond what Sam had imagined. Grace continued her role as a quiet leader, welcoming each new stray with gentle reassurance, her story inspiring all who met her. Months later, the once empty shelter was thriving. Families arrived regularly to adopt dogs saved by Grace's Haven. Emma and Jake helped every step of the way, their love for animals shining in their efforts. Sam stood outside the shelter one evening, watching Grace play with her pups under the fading sun. His heart swelled with gratitude. Grace had brought more than strays into their lives. She had brought purpose. If Grace's story touched your heart, remember, a single act of kindness can create a ripple of change. Share this story, subscribe to our channel, and help spread a message of hope and compassion. Together, we can make a difference for animals in need. Thank you for watching.